Welcome to this journey through one of the most significant photographs in American history. Before we begin, leave in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented historical records reach. The image before us freezes a moment that speaks volumes about the strange contradictions of war. 3 German prisoners of war sit on the ground, their Wehrmacht uniforms bearing the eagle insignia of the Third Reich, clearly visible. To their right, 2 American soldiers sit on wooden crates enjoying a meal from mess kits, while behind them, American guards stand watch with rifles on the other side of a barbed wire fence. The photograph, taken in 1944 at a location in the United States, captures an extraordinary scene: the juxtaposition of defeated enemy soldiers and their American captors, separated by both physical barriers and the vast gulf of their wartime experiences. The presence of food, including what appears to be fresh fruit and a Coca-Cola bottle visible near the prisoners, reveals something profound about the American war machine's capacity for abundance, even in the midst of global conflict. This single frame encapsulates a little-known chapter of World War II, the complex relationship between American military personnel and the nearly 400,000 German POWs who were transported to the United States during the war. The journey to this moment began years earlier across the Atlantic. By early 1943, the tide of the Second World War had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had surrendered in Tunisia, yielding over 130,000 prisoners. The Allied invasion of Sicily followed in July 1943, then mainland Italy in September, and finally the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. With each defeat, more German soldiers fell into Allied hands. The British, already struggling with rationing and limited space on their island nation, turned to their American allies for help with the growing prisoner population. The United States, with its vast territory and industrial might, agreed to take hundreds of thousands of these prisoners across the Atlantic, a maritime operation of staggering scale that remained largely hidden from the American public too. To military censorship and security concerns, the logistical challenges were immense. Converted troop ships that had carried American soldiers to the front lines now returned with holds full of German prisoners. The journey was perilous. German U-boats still patrolled the Atlantic, unaware they might be attacking ships carrying their own countrymen. According to military archives, the first major transfer began in April 1943, with 1,881 German POWs arriving in New York Harbor. As the Allies gained momentum, these numbers swelled dramatically. By December 1944, approximately 360,000 German prisoners had been transported to the United States, distributed among 5 to 11 main camps and smaller satellite facilities across 45 states. Only the extreme northeastern states and the Pacific Northwest hosted no major POW installations due to security concerns about their proximity to borders or coastlines. The decision to bring enemy soldiers to American soil was not made lightly. Initial plans had called for POW camps to be established in Great Britain, but the constant threat of German bombing made this impractical. The British government, faced with feeding its own population under strict rationing, also lacked resources to maintain large prisoner populations. American military planners proposed a solution: use America's vast interior, its abundant food supply, and its distance from the fighting to establish a network of camps that would both securely house prisoners and potentially provide labor for the American war economy. The Geneva Convention permitted using POW labor as long as it did not directly support the war effort against their homeland. President Roosevelt approved the plan in late 1942, and the War Department began identifying suitable locations, primarily military bases, fairgrounds, CCC camps, and other existing facilities that could be quickly converted. The men we see in this photograph represent both sides of a global conflict now playing out in microcosm on American soil. The three German prisoners sitting on the ground were most likely members of the Wehrmacht captured in North Africa, or Italy representing the average German soldier. Not necessarily ardent Nazis, but men conscripted to fight for their country. Their uniforms still bear the distinctive eagle insignia of the Third Reich, yet they sit here in the heartland of America, thousands of miles from the burning cities of Germany. Many German POWs were barely in their 20s, raised under the Nazi regime's strict propaganda that portrayed Americans as decadent, soft, and racially impure. Some had never traveled outside their hometowns before being drafted, much less crossed an ocean. Now they found themselves in a foreign land, confronted daily with the reality of American military power and industrial capacity. The two American soldiers eating their meal represent the victorious Allied forces. These men might have been guards assigned to the POW camp, or perhaps regular troops stationed nearby. Their relaxed posture as they eat, sitting on crates, rather than at formal mess tables, suggests the informal nature of this moment, perhaps during a brief break in their duties. Their proximity to the prisoners, separated only by the symbolic boundary of status, rather than the physical barrier of barbed wire, which appears to be holding back other guards in the background, speaks to the complex dynamics of captor and captive. These Americans might have recently returned from combat overseas, or might be preparing to ship out to the front lines, making their relationship with these enemy prisoners all the more psychologically complex. Looking more closely at the German prisoners, we can observe details that tell individual stories. Their uniforms show signs of wear, evidence of long campaigns before capture. The cut and insignia of their uniforms suggest they were likely Wehrmacht infantry rather than specialized units or SS. One soldier appears older than the others, perhaps a career military man or a reservist called up later in the war as Germany's manpower needs grew desperate. Their hair is cut short in military fashion, but not freshly trimmed, indicating they've been in captivity for some time. Their faces convey a mixture of emotions, resignation, wariness, and perhaps curiosity about the camera documenting their captivity. They sit with the distinctive posture of men who have learned to wait, a skill cultivated by soldiers and prisoners alike. The American soldiers, by contrast, exhibit a casualness that speaks to their security and status. Their uniforms are standard U.S. Army issue, clean but not formal, working uniforms for everyday duties. The mess kits they eat from are the standard aluminum type issued to American troops throughout the war. Practical, durable equipment designed for field conditions. What they're eating isn't clear from the image, but typical Army field rations. In 1944 included canned meats, processed cheese, crackers, and canned fruit, luxuries by European wartime standards. Their expressions are neutral, neither hostile toward the prisoners nor particularly friendly, suggesting the professional detachment that military training instilled, especially toward enemy combatants. The initial shock of capture was profound for most German POWs. According to interviews with former prisoners conducted by historian Arnold Kramer in the 1970s, many expected harsh treatment or even execution. Nazi propaganda had told them that Americans would show no mercy, particularly to SS troops. One former prisoner recalled, "We were told Americans would pull out our fingernails, that they hated Germans too much for fair treatment. Instead, they experienced a methodical processing system. After preliminary holding in Europe, they were searched, documented, and classified based on their level of Nazi indoctrination. Confirmed Nazi Party members and SS officers were separated from regular Wehrmacht soldiers. They were issued standard POW uniforms, often surplus American Army clothing with PW prominently painted on the back. They received medical examinations, vaccinations, and a substantial meal, often their first full meal in months. The transatlantic journey was a transformative experience for many prisoners. Packed into converted troop ships, men who had been fighting in the deserts of North Africa or the mountains of Italy suddenly found themselves crossing the vast Atlantic. Many had never seen the ocean before. Seasickness was common, and fear of submarine attack created constant tension. Yet even during this journey, differences between American abundance and European scarcity became evident. According to ship manifests and prisoner accounts, the daily food allowance for POWs in transit matched that of the American crew, approximately 3,000 calories per day. One prisoner later wrote home, "Even on the ship, with limited space and facilities, we received 3 full meals each day, portions that would feed a German family for a week." Upon arrival in American ports, usually New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans, prisoners faced another shock: the undamaged skylines of American cities. Having lived through years of bombing in Germany or witnessed the destruction of European cities, the sight of intact urban landscapes was disorienting. As they were transported by train to camps in the American interior, many recorded their impressions of the countryside. One prisoner's diary, now in the National Archives, notes, "Endless fields of grain, fat cattle grazing, farm equipment everywhere, no sign that a war is happening. America seems untouched, as if we are arriving in peacetime." This visual evidence of American productive capacity challenged Nazi propaganda claims about American weakness and decadence. The photographer who captured this moment was likely a military documentarian, perhaps working for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, tasked with recording the conditions of POW camps for both historical documentation and to demonstrate American compliance with international law. Using a standard-issue speed graphic camera, the workhorse of war photographers, he would have needed to carefully compose this shot to communicate multiple layers of meaning: the security measures in place, the armed guards and barbed wire, the relationship between American personnel and German prisoners, and the contrast between captivity and relative freedom. The photographer took considerable risk in positioning himself close to enemy prisoners, though these men appear subdued, perhaps even resigned to their situation. The stark black and white film stock, typical of wartime photography, emphasizes the contrasts in the scene between prisoner and guard, confinement and relative comfort, enemy and host. Photography within POW camps was tightly regulated. The Geneva Convention protected prisoners from being photographed in ways that might humiliate them or expose them to public curiosity, so all official photography had to be approved through military channels. Photographers needed special clearance to enter the camps, and their work was subject to security review before release. The military recognized the potential propaganda value of such images, both positive, demonstrating humane treatment, and negative, risking public sympathy for enemy soldiers while American boys died overseas. This dual concern meant that many photographs, including possibly this one, remained classified until after the war ended. The technical aspects of this photograph reveal much about the circumstances. The depth of field suggests the use of a moderately small aperture, probably f8 or f11, allowing both the prisoners in the foreground and the guards in the background to remain in focus. The even lighting indicates it was taken during midday, under clear skies. The photographer likely used a shutter speed of at least 1/125th of a second to avoid any motion blur from the subjects. While color film existed in 1944, it was reserved primarily for special projects. Black and white film was standard for military documentation, using Kodak Tri-X or similar stock that could be developed in field conditions. The photograph's composition follows classic documentary principles, capturing the subjects engaged in natural activity rather than posed, yet framed to tell a complete story within a single image. The physical setting of this photograph provides clues about the camp's location and conditions. The open terrain visible in the background suggests this was likely a camp in the Midwest, Southwest, or possibly Texas, regions where many large POW facilities were established. The barbed wire fence appears substantial but not overwhelming. Typically, POW camps featured double fences approximately 10 feet high with guard towers positioned at regular intervals. The ground is flat and dusty, indicating this might be a camp built on former agricultural land or a military training ground. Military records indicate that by 1944, standard POW compounds housed approximately 1,000 to 2,000 prisoners in barracks organized into companies of 250 men. Each company had its own mess hall, latrine, and recreation area. The relative informality of this scene, prisoners sitting on the ground, Americans eating on crates, suggests this might be a work break rather than a formal mealtime, perhaps during agricultural labor or camp maintenance. The exact moment frozen in this photograph was likely midday, possibly lunchtime in 1944. While the American Guards stand vigilant with their M1 Garand rifles, the standard issue weapon that General George Patton called the greatest battle. Implement ever devised, the scene captures a moment of relative calm in the daily routine of the camp. The contrast between the American soldiers eating their meal and the German prisoners sitting on the ground creates a powerful visual hierarchy that reflects the realities of their respective situations. Yet, the presence of food nearby, including what appears to be a Coca-Cola bottle, an iconic American product, suggests that even the prisoners had access to provisions that would have been considered luxurious in war-torn Europe. The scene unfolds in what appears to be the Midwest, or possibly Texas, where many large POW camps were established near agricultural areas to utilize prisoner labor for farming, a practice allowed under the Geneva Convention as long as the work did not directly support the war effort against their homeland. Military records indicate that the typical daily diet for German POWs in America included portions that would astonish civilians back in Germany. Breakfast often featured eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Lunch included meat, vegetables, and dessert. Dinner provided another full meal with meat or fish. This diet, providing approximately 3,000 calories per day, was calculated to match what American soldiers received, as required by the Geneva Convention. By comparison, civilians in Germany by 1944 were surviving on less than 1,500 calories per day of increasingly poor quality food. The appearance of Coca-Cola in this image is particularly telling. The soft drink had become a symbol of America worldwide, and its availability even in proximity to prisoners demonstrated the stunning productive capacity of the American economy. The camp kitchens themselves became sites of cultural exchange. Initially, American cooks prepared food according to standard Army recipes, but many camps eventually allowed German prisoners to work in the kitchens, adapting American ingredients to more familiar German dishes. A report from Camp Hearn, Texas, notes that German baker prisoners had transformed the standard white bread recipe into something approximating German-style rolls, much to everyone's satisfaction. This culinary adaptation represented a small but significant accommodation that improved prisoner morale while maintaining compliance with Geneva Convention requirements about proper nutrition. What the camera cannot capture are the sounds and smells of this moment, the metallic clank of mess kits, the murmured conversations in two languages, the occasional command from the guards, perhaps the distant sound of vehicles or machinery operating elsewhere in the camp. The smell of military rations would have been particularly poignant for the German prisoners. By 1944, civilians in Germany were surviving on severely restricted rations, with real coffee, white flour, and fresh fruit long since disappeared. From markets, we cannot hear the thoughts racing through the minds of these prisoners either. The relief at being alive and relatively safe, the guilt at being captured while comrades continued to fight and die, the uncertainty about the fate of their families under increasingly devastating Allied bombing campaigns back home. Camp sounds followed predictable patterns that structured prisoner life. The day began with reveille, often played on traditional German military instruments, by prisoner musicians. Roll calls were conducted in German by the prisoners' own non-commissioned officers, maintaining military hierarchy within the camps as permitted by the Geneva Convention. Throughout the day, a mixture of English and German commands would echo across the compound. Some camps broadcast news and music through loudspeaker systems, carefully selected content that included classical music, approved German songs, and news reports about Allied advances, part of the subtle psychological campaign to convince prisoners that Germany's defeat was inevitable. At night, the distinctive sound of searchlights sweeping the compound and the periodic call of "all clear" from guards making their rounds marked the transition to the quiet hours. The racial dynamics of this scene warrant consideration as well. At the same time these white German prisoners received treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention, African American soldiers serving in the U.S. military faced segregation and discrimination. Some German POWs, conditioned by Nazi racial ideology, were shocked to find themselves under guard by Black American soldiers. In several documented instances, German prisoners initially refused to take orders from black guards, only to face immediate consequences for such defiance. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this dynamic was how it undermined Nazi racial propaganda. Many German prisoners, after months or years in America, wrote in diaries and letters about how their prejudices had been challenged by their experiences. One former POW interviewed decades later recalled, "I was raised to believe. These men were subhuman, but they treated me with more dignity as a prisoner than I had shown to civilians in occupied territories." This racial dynamic created complex situations. In many southern states, German POWs could enter restaurants, movie theaters, and other establishments that excluded Black Americans, including black soldiers in uniform. A particularly notorious incident occurred in Fort Lawton, Washington, where German POWs were permitted to eat in the main post exchange, while black soldiers were relegated to segregated facilities. This contradiction between America's fight against Nazi racism abroad while maintaining racial segregation at home was not lost on Black Americans. The Pittsburgh Courier, a prominent black newspaper, published an editorial in 1944 noting the irony that Hitler's soldiers are treated better in America than Black American soldiers. These contradictions would help fuel the civil rights movement that gained momentum after the war. The immediate aftermath of scenes like this one often included bewilderment among newly arrived German prisoners. According to declassified intelligence reports, many POWs initially refused the food offered, suspecting it was a propaganda display that would be withdrawn after photographs were taken. Others thought they were being fed better than American soldiers, which would violate the Geneva Convention. When they realized this was standard American fare, that even the guards ate similarly well, many experienced a profound psychological crisis. Interrogation transcripts reveal comments like, "If Americans eat like this during wartime, what must it be like during peace?" And, "No wonder we could not defeat such a nation." Some prisoners even wrote to families in Germany describing the food, only to have their letters redacted by censors who feared such reports would damage German morale. The reality of American abundance created complex emotions for the prisoners. While grateful for humane treatment, many struggled with the knowledge that their own families faced increasing hardship. By late 1944, German civilians were experiencing severe food shortages. Allied bombing had disrupted transportation networks, and resources were prioritized for frontline troops. Reports reached prisoners through Red Cross messages of families subsisting on turnips and bread made with sawdust filler. This knowledge created a painful paradox. Prisoners were often better fed than their own children back home. Some refused. certain luxuries out of solidarity with their families, while others rationalized that they should maintain their strength for eventual return. Camp authorities observed increased depression among prisoners as news of Germany's deteriorating situation reached them, particularly after the devastating Allied bombing of Dresden in February 1945. The daily routine in POW camps followed military precision. Reveille typically sounded at 5:45 a.m., followed by breakfast at 6:15. Work details departed at 7:30, with prisoners assigned to agricultural labor, camp maintenance, or various industrial jobs not directly related to war production. They returned for lunch, then worked until 4:30 p.m. Evenings featured dinner, followed by free time for educational classes, camp newspapers, sports, or theatrical productions, all allowed under the Geneva Convention to maintain morale and mental health. Prisoners received the same wages as American soldiers would for equivalent work, 80 cents per day, paid in scrip redeemable at the camp canteen for items like toiletries, snacks, cigarettes, or beer, limited to 2 bottles per day. This structured environment, combined with good food and fair treatment, meant that escape attempts were remarkably rare, fewer than 2,500 attempts from a population of 400,000, with nearly all escapees quickly recaptured. Camp cultural life flourished in ways that surprised both prisoners and guards. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to recreational and intellectual activities. Many camps developed orchestras, theater groups, and sports teams. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners constructed a full soccer field and organized a league with teams representing different German regions. Camp Algona in Iowa became famous for its prisoner craftsmen, who built an elaborate nativity scene with wooden figures that is still displayed every Christmas. Artistic prisoners painted murals in mess halls and created sculptures from available materials. One former POW, now a successful artist in Germany, credited his camp art classes with launching his career. "I found my artistic voice in captivity, an irony I've never fully reconciled." Intellectual life was equally rich. Campy. Libraries contained thousands of volumes, including German-language books donated by American universities. Harvard University's German department provided books to several Northeast camps, carefully selecting works banned under Nazi rule to reintroduce prisoners to Germany's humanistic traditions. Prisoners organized lecture series on topics ranging from engineering to philosophy, taught by fellow prisoners with academic backgrounds. The Army encouraged this intellectual activity, recognizing its value in combating Nazi ideology. At Camp Kennedy in Texas, a former university professor organized what prisoners called the Desert University, offering courses in mathematics, literature, and history with formal examinations and certificates that some prisoners later used to continue their education in post-war Germany. Religion played a significant role in camp life. Many prisoners found solace in religious practice, particularly as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The Army provided Catholic and Protestant chaplains for prisoners, sometimes German Americans or refugees from Nazi persecution who could conduct services in German. Jewish chaplains occasionally ministered to the small number of Jewish German soldiers captured fighting for the Wehrmacht, often men of partial Jewish ancestry who had concealed their heritage. Religious holidays became important community events. Christmas celebrations were particularly elaborate, with prisoners crafting decorations and preparing traditional German holiday foods from available ingredients. At Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners constructed a chapel using salvaged materials, complete with handcrafted altar and stained glass windows made from colored cellophane, a structure so beautiful that local residents would visit to admire it on supervised tours. The path this image took to reach the public was complicated by wartime information controls. Military censors were concerned about American public opinion, showing enemy soldiers in proximity to American troops eating. Well, while American families dealt with rationing could provoke resentment, yet there was also propaganda value in demonstrating American humanitarian treatment of prisoners, particularly as evidence mounted about Nazi mistreatment of Allied POWs. This photograph was likely first reviewed by military censors, then released to news agencies with carefully crafted captions emphasizing security measures rather than the conditions of captivity. It may have appeared in publications like Life magazine or local newspapers near POW camps, though often such images were held until after particularly bloody battles to avoid controversy during periods of American casualties. The censorship process was thorough. Army Signal Corps photographers submitted their film for development to military processing centers, where images were printed and reviewed by military intelligence officers. Those approved received captions written by public relations staff emphasizing America's compliance with international law rather than the quality of provisions. Some images were reserved for limited distribution to international observers like the Red Cross or neutral Swiss authorities who monitored POW treatment. Even POW camp newsletters, produced by prisoners themselves under supervision, were carefully monitored to prevent any content that might create tension with the American public or provide useful intelligence if issues reached enemy hands. Internal government debates about POW publicity were intense. The War Department's Public Relations Bureau advocated for more transparency, arguing that showing humane treatment demonstrated American moral superiority. Military intelligence officers worried about security breaches and potential public backlash. The State Department considered the diplomatic implications, particularly how such images might affect treatment of American POWs in German hands. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Limited, carefully controlled information would be released primarily through local newspapers in communities near camps, with national coverage focused on the security aspects rather than the living conditions. This photograph likely emerged from that compromise policy, approved for release to demonstrate both security measures and compliance with international law. When Americans did see such images, reactions were mixed. Initially, there was fear and suspicion about enemy troops on American soil. In some communities near POW camps, local newspapers ran editorials warning residents about fraternization with Nazi killers. Yet, as the war progressed and prisoners began working on farms and in factories, many Americans came to see them as individuals rather than faceless enemies. Farmers reported that German POWs were hard-working and disciplined. Some American guards developed cordial relationships with prisoners who spoke English. There were even instances where prisoners saved for American families the rationed items they received in Red Cross packages, but didn't need, given the abundance of their camp meals. By war's end, public perception had shifted remarkably, with many communities expressing concern about the welfare of their Germans when repatriation began. This evolution in public sentiment reflected broader American values. Despite the propaganda portraying Germans as monsters, many Americans recognized a distinction between the Nazi regime and ordinary German soldiers. Communities with strong German-American heritage, particularly in the Midwest, often viewed prisoners through the lens of shared cultural backgrounds. Churches near camps sometimes offered German-language services that prisoners could attend under guard. Local newspapers gradually shifted from alarmist warnings to human interest stories about prisoner art exhibitions or musical performances. One Iowa newspaper in 1945 published a feature on a POW camp choir that sang Christmas carols for local residents, noting, "Their voices made us remember that peace on earth will mean these men returning to their own families." Interactions between prisoners and civilians created lasting connections. Despite official prohibitions against fraternization, daily contact through work programs inevitably led to human relationships. German prisoners working on farms often ate meals with farm families. Female factory workers exchanged conversation, with prisoners working alongside them. These interactions, multiplied across hundreds of communities, created a grassroots diplomacy that would influence post-war German-American relations. A farmer in Minnesota recalled, "They started as Feinde, enemy, but by harvest's end they were Karl and Franz, good workers who showed me pictures of their families." These personal connections humanized the enemy on both sides, challenging the dehumanizing rhetoric of wartime propaganda. The economic impact of the POW labor program was significant and largely positive for American communities. With millions of American men serving overseas and industrial production at full capacity, the agricultural sector faced severe labor shortages. German prisoners filled this gap, harvesting crops that might otherwise have rotted in fields. Department of Agriculture records indicate that in 1944 alone, POW labor saved approximately 50 million man-days of agricultural work, particularly in labor-intensive crops like cotton, sugar beets, and citrus fruits. Prisoners also worked in food processing plants, lumber operations, and ice plants. Their labor was credited with preventing food shortages and price spikes that could have damaged both civilian morale and military supply chains. The program operated at a profit for the U.S. government, with payments from employers covering camp operations and prisoners' wages, while still allowing for the humane treatment depicted in this photograph. Prisoners generally welcomed work and assignments which relieved the monotony of camp life and provided opportunities to interact with the outside world. The labor program was voluntary under the Geneva Convention, though refusing work meant forfeiting wages used at the camp canteen. Different types of work carried different prestige among the prisoners. Agricultural labor was most common, with prisoners harvesting everything from citrus in Florida to potatoes in Maine. Some prisoners worked in food processing, canning the vegetables they had harvested. Others performed camp maintenance or manufactured furniture and crafts sold to the public through approved channels. A select group with specialized skills worked in hospitals as orderlies or in technical positions like equipment repair. Competition for these more prestigious assignments was intense, with prisoners often using their pre-war credentials to secure better positions. For the men pictured here, the future held unexpected turns. Unlike many wartime photographs where subjects remain anonymous, POW records allow us to trace some outcomes. Based on similar documented cases, we can reasonably reconstruct their likely fates. Most German POWs remained in America until 1945-46, working in agriculture, logging, or food processing. They were paid small wages according to the Geneva Convention, which many saved to take home. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the repatriation process began, but it was complicated by the division of Germany into occupation zones. POWs from areas that became the Soviet zone often desperately tried to avoid return, fearing, correctly, that they would be sent to Soviet labor camps. Those from what would become West Germany typically returned to find their homes destroyed, economies collapsed, and families traumatized. Some prisoners had undergone denazification education in special camps, like Fort Eustis, Virginia, returning to Germany with democratic ideals and English language skills that proved valuable. During Reconstruction, repatriation itself was a complex operation. The Army organized prisoners by their home regions, which after 1945 meant sorting them according to occupation zones: American, British, French, or Soviet. Priority for return went first to the sick and wounded, then to those from the Western zones. Prisoners bound for the Soviet zone often attempted to escape or otherwise delay their return, having heard reports of harsh treatment awaiting them. Some prisoners desperately sought American sponsors who might help them immigrate legally after repatriation. By 1946, most prisoners had been returned to Europe, though a small number remained until 1947, working specialized jobs or awaiting resolution of immigration applications. Their departure often proved emotional for both prisoners and the communities where they had lived. At Camp Algona, Iowa, local farmers organized a farewell dinner for their prisoners. In Clarinda, Iowa, the town band played German folk songs as the train carrying prisoners departed. The psychological transformation of many prisoners was perhaps the most significant long-term outcome. American authorities implemented an ambitious intellectual diversion program in the camps designed to expose prisoners to democratic values without heavy-handed propaganda that might backfire. Camp libraries stocked German-language books banned under the Nazi regime. Film nights showed American movies that subtly depicted the benefits of democracy. A carefully designed education program offered classes in English, American history, and democratic governance taught by fellow prisoners who had lived in America before the war or by German-speaking American professors. A special newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, was created for POW readership, featuring articles by anti-Nazi German intellectuals. While hardened Nazis resisted these efforts, military intelligence estimated that approximately 30,000 prisoners completed formal democracy training before repatriation. This re-education program represented a significant innovation in American policy. Rather than vindictive punishment, American authorities chose to invest in transforming former enemies into potential allies. The program was remarkably sophisticated, for its time employing cultural anthropologists, psychologists, and German émigré intellectuals to design curricula that would appeal to German cultural traditions while introducing democratic values. Special training camps like Fort Eustis, Virginia, and Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, offered intensive democracy education for prisoners identified as potential future leaders. The faculty included prominent German refugees like the philosopher Herbert Marcuse and the political scientist Carl Friedrich. This investment in hearts and minds foreshadowed America's post-war approach to occupied Germany and Japan, where cultural and educational programs would play central roles in democratic reconstruction. Remarkably, several hundred former German POWs eventually immigrated to the United States legally after the war, often settling near their former camps. They cited their humane treatment and the abundance they had witnessed as reasons for wanting to build new lives in America. According to a 1988 study by historian Arnold Kramer, approximately 5,000 former German POWs eventually became American citizens. Some maintained correspondence with their former guards or the farmers they had worked for, creating unlikely friendships that spanned decades and continents. One former prisoner, interviewed for a PBS documentary in 1994, remarked, "I came to America as Hitler's soldier, but left as America's admirer. The food was my first lesson in democracy. These former prisoners who returned to Germany became informal ambassadors for American values and culture. Many used their English language skills to find employment with American occupation authorities or with American companies establishing European operations after the war. Their first-hand experience of American abundance made them natural advocates for market economics and democratic governance. Some became involved in local politics, helping to establish democratic institutions in their communities. The speed with which West Germany rebuilt and reoriented itself toward democratic governance owed something to these hundreds of thousands of men who had experienced American society firsthand during their captivity. These personal connections extended beyond individual relationships. In several cases, former POWs facilitated economic and cultural exchanges between their hometowns in Germany and the American communities where they had been held. The town of Huntsville, Texas, where a major POW camp had operated, established a sister city relationship with Meisenthal, Germany, after a former prisoner became mayor there. Similar connections emerged between communities in Wisconsin, Michigan, and New Mexico and their German counterparts. These grassroots relationships, built on the foundation of humane treatment, contributed significantly to post-war reconciliation between former enemies. In 1984, during the 40th anniversary of D-Day, several American communities hosted reunions where former POWs returned to visit their old camps, often meeting with their former guards in emotional encounters that made local and sometimes national news. The historical significance of this photograph extends beyond the immediate moment it captures. It documents a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that combined military might with material abundance and, at least in principle, adherence to international law. The POW program became an unexpected soft power victory for America. Military intelligence estimated that nearly 80% of German POWs held in America returned to Germany with markedly improved opinions of the United States. These men became informal ambassadors during the crucial early Cold War years, particularly in West Germany, where their first-hand experiences contradicted Soviet propaganda about American imperialism. Some historians have suggested that the positive relationships formed during the POW program helped facilitate West Germany's remarkably rapid integration into the Western alliance system after the war. The American approach stood in stark contrast to the treatment of prisoners in other theaters. While conditions varied widely, German POWs in Soviet captivity faced mortality rates approaching 35%. Of approximately 3 million German POWs in Soviet hands, as many as 1 million died from malnutrition, exposure, or forced labor in the harsh Siberian climate. Those who survived often remained in captivity for up to 10 years after the war's end. German treatment of Soviet POWs was even worse, deliberately genocidal in many cases, with mortality rates exceeding 50%. Against this backdrop, American adherence to the Geneva Convention, as documented in this photograph, represents not just compliance with international law, but a moral choice with lasting geopolitical implications. Many historians credit the positive impression made on German POWs as a factor in West Germany's quick and firm alignment with the United States in the emerging Cold War, an alignment that would prove crucial during the Berlin airlift and subsequent Cold War confrontations. The photograph also offers insight into American society during wartime. Despite the existential struggle against fascism, America maintained sufficient production capacity to feed its own population, its military, and its prisoners, according to international standards. This abundance wasn't just economic. It represented a philosophical resilience. Even facing a mortal enemy that had committed atrocities across Europe, American authorities largely resisted pressure to engage in retaliatory mistreatment of prisoners. There were exceptions and imperfections. Instances of guard brutality were documented, particularly toward confirmed Nazi Party members, and some camps implemented harsher conditions than others. Yet the overall program reflected a national commitment to maintaining humanitarian standards even during total war. The presence of Coca-Cola bottles in this image merits special attention as a symbol of American soft power. By 1944, Coca-Cola had become so identified with America that the company had been granted special status by the War Department. Despite sugar rationing, the beverage remained available to American troops, and, as we see in proximity to both American soldiers and German prisoners, it represented the mysterious appeal of American consumer culture, a cultural force that would play a significant role in the post-war European recovery and the eventual Western victory in the Cold War. That these enemy soldiers were exposed to this iconic American product while still in uniform represented a kind of cultural conquest that foreshadowed the global spread of American commercial influence after the war. The Coca-Cola bottle visible in this photograph represents more than just a beverage. It symbolizes the industrial and cultural power that would ultimately help America win both the war and the peace that followed. During the war, Coca-Cola had received special allocation of sugar despite civilian rationing because the War Department considered it important for troop morale. General Eisenhower himself had requested 10 bottling plants be sent to Europe to supply American troops. The company's president, Robert Woodruff, had famously promised that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. This commitment required logistical innovation on a global scale, creating portable bottling plants that could be deployed to the front lines, and developing a powdered concentrate when shipping the syrup proved impractical. For German prisoners encountering this ubiquitous American product, it represented not just a sweet drink, but a glimpse into the consumer culture that would help reshape their homeland after the war. When these men returned to a devastated Germany, the arrival of Coca-Cola in the American zone of occupation in 1947 would become a powerful symbol of Germany's reintegration into Western markets and culture. The scene captured here also illuminates the complex moral calculations of wartime America. While the United States generally adhered to the Geneva Convention regarding European POWs, its treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese Americanos civilians revealed troubling inconsistencies. Japanese American citizens were interned in camps that, while not as harsh as POW facilities in other nations, nevertheless represented a failure to uphold constitutional principles. Japanese POWs, though few in number due to the Japanese military code that discouraged surrender, often faced harsher treatment than their German counterparts. This disparity reflected the racial dimensions of the Pacific War and represents a sobering counterpoint to the relatively humane treatment documented in this photograph of German prisoners. The contrast highlights the ongoing struggle between America's highest ideals and its periodic failures to apply those ideals consistently across racial and cultural boundaries. These inconsistencies did not go unnoticed. African American newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier published editorials questioning why enemy soldiers received better treatment than Black American citizens. Congressional representatives from states with large Japanese American populations raised similar concerns about the contrast between German POW treatment and Japanese American internment. These criticisms, while censored during wartime, contributed to post-war civil rights momentum and the eventual formal apology and reparations for Japanese American internment decades later. The differential treatment revealed America's complicated relationship with race, even as it fought against Nazi racial ideology, a contradiction that would fuel domestic social change in the decades following the war. The photograph serves as a window into the psychological dimensions of the POW experience. The expressions on the prisoners' faces reveal the complex emotional landscape of captivity, relief at survival mixed with uncertainty about the future, comfort in present safety shadowed by concern for loved ones in a collapsing Germany, and the cognitive dissonance of receiving humane treatment from an enemy they had been trained to hate. Military psychologists studying the POW camps noted the stages of adjustment most prisoners experienced: initial shock and suspicion, followed by depression as the reality of defeat set in, then gradual acceptance and adaptation to camp life. Many prisoners formed close bonds with fellow captives from different regions of Germany, creating a shared identity that transcended the provincial loyalties that had previously defined their sense of German nationhood. This psychological evolution would prove significant when they returned to help rebuild a democratic Germany from the ashes of the Third Reich. Military intelligence officers recognized the psychological value of humane treatment. Captain Alexander Stephan, who interviewed thousands of German prisoners for intelligence purposes, noted, "Prisoners who experienced decent treatment were far more likely to provide useful information than those who faced harsh conditions." This pragmatic insight influenced American interrogation methods. Rather than physical coercion, American intelligence officers relied on building rapport, offering small comforts like cigarettes or coffee, and engaging prisoners in conversations that indirectly yielded valuable information. This approach proved remarkably effective. Intelligence gathered from German POWs in America contributed significantly to understanding German military capabilities, technological developments, and civilian morale. The success of these methods would influence American military intelligence doctrine for decades, though these lessons would sometimes be forgotten in later conflicts. The educational impact of the POW experience extended beyond formal democracy. Training. Simply living in America provided many prisoners with their first exposure to a functioning, multi-ethnic democracy. While segregation and discrimination certainly existed in 1940s America, prisoners still witnessed a society where different religious groups coexisted without state persecution, where civilian life continued with remarkable normalcy despite the war, and where economic opportunity seemed within reach of ordinary citizens. For men raised under Nazi control of information, these observations challenged core assumptions. Camp libraries reported that prisoners avidly read American newspapers, initially to find propaganda, but gradually developing appreciation for press freedom. The Army established a special POW university at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, where anti-Nazi prisoners received intensive training in democratic governance, federalism, and civic participation, skills many would later use as local officials. In post-war Germany, this educational effort extended to media as well. The War Department created a special newspaper for German POWs, Der Ruf, The Call, edited by intellectual prisoners but overseen by American authorities. The paper featured news about the war's progress, cultural articles, and essays promoting democratic values. The Army also produced a special radio program, The Prisoner of War Hour, broadcast to camps nationwide, featuring classical music, news, and educational content. Special film screenings showed documentaries about American life, carefully selected, Hollywood movies that portrayed democratic values positively, and newsreels showing German war damage to counter any remaining belief in eventual German victory. This multimedia approach represented a sophisticated psychological operation designed to transform enemy soldiers into potential democratic allies, an early example of what would later be called public diplomacy, the integration of former POWs into post-war German society had significant implications for both Germanys. In West Germany, returning prisoners with positive experiences often became advocates for democratic reforms and close ties with the United States. Several rose to positions of influence in local government, education, and business, helping to shape the emerging democratic culture. The speed of West Germany's reintegration into the community of nations, becoming a NATO member by 1955, just 10 years after total defeat, owed something to these informal ambassadors. In East Germany, Soviet authorities viewed returning POWs from America with suspicion. Many faced discrimination in employment and education, or were forced to undergo re-education in Soviet ideology. Some were even imprisoned as suspected. American agents. This divergent treatment reinforced the growing division between the two Germanys and contributed to the steady stream of refugees fleeing east to west before the Berlin Wall's construction in 1961. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of German POWs became a powerful Cold War narrative. West German publications featured accounts from former prisoners comparing their experiences in American and Soviet captivity. One widely circulated memoir, I Was Stalin's Prisoner by Heinrich Eilderman, contrasted the author's 3 years in an American POW camp, where he received adequate food and medical care, with his subsequent 5 years in a Soviet labor camp where he witnessed thousands die from malnutrition and exposure. Such accounts reinforced West German alignment with the United States and NATO during crucial Cold War years. American diplomatic officers in Germany actively cultivated relationships with former POWs, recognizing their value as credible voices against Soviet propaganda claiming American mistreatment of prisoners. The long-term impact of the POW program on American-German relations cannot be overstated. When West Germany re-established its military in 1955 as the Bundeswehr, many of its initial officer corps had spent time as POWs in America. Their positive experiences influenced the new German military's orientation toward NATO and acceptance of American leadership within the alliance. Economic ties between the nations were similarly strengthened by the network of personal connections established during captivity. German businesses seeking American partners often employed former POWs who spoke English and understood American business practices. Tourism between the countries benefited as well. Many former prisoners returned to America as visitors, bringing family members to see the places where they had been held. By the 1970s, formal friendship societies had been established in several German cities, maintaining connections with the American communities where POW camps had operated. Today, this photograph speaks to us across decades about the power of human dignity, even amid global conflict. While the photograph shows armed guards and barbed wire, necessary security measures for enemy combatants, it also reveals a nation confident enough in its values to treat prisoners humanely while its own soldiers eat nearby. The Coca-Cola bottles and food were not merely sustenance, but powerful symbols of an economic system that could produce abundance even during total war. For modern viewers, the image raises profound questions about how societies balance security with humanity during conflicts, about the power of personal experience to overcome propaganda, and about war's strange capacity to create unexpected moments of cross-cultural understanding. As tensions rise in our own era and new conflicts emerge, this quiet moment of American soldiers eating near German prisoners reminds us that even the bitterest enemies may one day sit at the same table. This photograph reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual actions matter. The American policymakers who insisted on Geneva Convention compliance, the camp commanders who enforced humane treatment, the guards who refrained from vindictiveness, and the farmers and employers who treated prisoners with respect, all contributed to an outcome that transcended the immediate military situation. Their collective choices created the conditions for reconciliation and alliance where continuing hatred might have seemed more natural. The men in this photograph could not have known they were participating in a moment that would influence international relations for decades to come. They were simply soldiers and prisoners, eating their daily meals, caught in the machinery of global war. Yet their experience, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of similar interactions, helped lay the groundwork for one of history's most successful post-conflict reconciliations. The aftermath of the POW program continues to resonate in unexpected ways. The approximately 372,000 German POWs held in the United States represented the largest group of enemy soldiers ever housed on American soil. Their story has been largely overshadowed by the dominant narratives of combat and civilian sacrifice, yet it constitutes an important chapter in both American and German history. The program's success, measured by low mortality rates, economic productivity, and positive psychological impact, demonstrated that adhering to international humanitarian standards could serve national interests even during existential conflicts. In the decades since, when debates about the treatment of captured combatants have emerged during conflicts from Vietnam to the War on Terror, historians and policymakers have sometimes pointed to the World War II POW program as evidence that humane treatment can advance both moral and strategic objectives. Recent scholarship has brought renewed attention to this chapter of World War II history. Historians like Arnold Kramer, Judith Gansberg, and Richard Whittingham have conducted extensive interviews with former prisoners and guards, preserving first-hand accounts before this generation passes away. Local historical societies near former campsites have collected artifacts, letters, and photographs, creating small museums dedicated to this overlooked aspect of the war. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans now includes a permanent exhibit on the POW program, featuring oral histories from both prisoners and their American guards. This scholarly and commemorative work ensures that the lessons of this historical episode about humanity amid conflict, about the power of cultural exchange, and about the potential for reconciliation between enemies continue to inform our understanding of war and peace. The physical legacy of the POW program has largely disappeared from the American landscape. Most camps were dismantled shortly after the war, their temporary structures repurposed or demolished. Yet, in communities across America, subtle reminders persist. In Aliceville, Alabama, a small museum preserves artifacts and stories from the local POW camp. In Frederick, Oklahoma, a POW cemetery contains the graves of those who died in captivity, still maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, stone monuments built by German prisoners still stand. In fields across the Midwest and South, drainage systems and agricultural improvements constructed by prisoner labor continue to serve American farms. These physical remnants, like the photograph we've examined, offer tangible connections to a time when enemies became temporary neighbors, and when America's material abundance became an unexpected instrument of soft power and future reconciliation. The story of German POWs in America offers a counter-narrative to the dominant themes of World War II history. While the main narrative rightly focuses on combat, Holocaust, and destruction, this subsidiary story reminds us of humanity's capacity for restraint, pragmatism, and eventual reconciliation. The men in this photograph, both prisoners and guards, were participants in a historical process that transcended the immediate military conflict. Their experience reminds us that even in total war, choices about how to treat the enemy have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield or the prison camp. The America that emerged from World War II as a superpower demonstrated not just military and economic might, but also a capacity for magnanimity that would serve its interests in the post-war order. The American soldiers and German prisoners captured in this photograph could not have known they were modeling a path from enmity to alliance that would help define the second half of the 20th century. As we conclude our examination of this remarkable photograph, we're reminded that history is rarely as simple as propaganda posters suggest. The image of German prisoners sitting near American soldiers enjoying their meal captures the paradoxes of modern warfare, the humanity that persists even across battle lines, the power of direct experience to overcome indoctrination, and the complex legacy of choices made during humanity's darkest hours. In this frozen moment from 1944, we glimpse not just a historical curiosity, but a profound lesson about war and peace that resonates to this day. The story of German POWs in America reminds us that how we treat our enemies in wartime shapes the peace that follows, and that respect for human dignity, even toward those we must fight, represents not weakness, but strategic wisdom and moral strength.